Right, welcome everyone. On behalf of the Southeast PTTC, Southeast Prevention Technology Transfer Center, my name is Ashley Trinidad and I'm a graduate student researcher supporting the Southeast PTTC team. I'm going to briefly tell you a little bit about the SCPTTC and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Mark Wolfson to get us started. First, a bit of a disclaimer, the SCPTTC and all the PTTCs in the network are 100% funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration. However, the contents you're going to hear from today's presenters don't necessarily reflect the official views or positions of SAMHSA or the US government. So the PTTC is a national network of regional centers that equips the prevention workforce and with evidence-based tools, training, and resources to prevent substance abuse before it starts and strengthen communities. So this graphic here shows the PTTC network. There are 10 regional centers across the United States. We are here at Wake Forest School of Medicine in North Carolina, and we are home to the Southeast PTTC, which serves 8 states shown in the light green, located on the lower right side of the map. We are under the direction of Drs. Kimberly Wagner and Mark Wolfson. So before we get started with the webinar, we'll go over a few housekeeping items. So the webinar will be recorded and available on our YouTube channel in about 2 to 3 days. At the end of the webinar, you will have the opportunity to fill out an evaluation form. In order for you to receive your certificate for attending this webinar, you must fill out the evaluation form. And when you fill out the form, you might get a message asking to allow a pop-up page, and you must click allow in order for you to access that certificate. So without further ado, here is Dr. Mark Wolfson, who is a professor and chair at the University of California, Riverside, UCR, Dr. Traci Toomey, professor at the University of Minnesota, and Dr. Matthew Rossheim, an associate professor at the University of Texas, which got cut off. I'm sorry.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Ashley. Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, welcome, everybody. And I'm so happy to be here with my longtime colleague and former student, Traci Toomey, many years ago, and with my medium-term colleague. I've known Matt for about 5 or 6 years now, but he's really emerged as a leader in this field as well. So if we can go to the next slide. We do have a learning competency and objectives for this session. We hope by the end of the session, you'll feel comfortable analyzing the role of policy interventions in alcohol, tobacco, and other drug prevention. And in terms of specific learning objectives, there are 3. We hope you'll be able to discuss the benefits of policy related to ATOD, policy interventions. We hope you'll be able to describe the theory and evidence for policy and discuss prevention professionals and others' role in policy. So if we could go to the next slide. So here's our agenda for today's webinar. I want to take a few minutes to talk about the Southeast PTTC's new policy curriculum. And then we'll get into the meat of it. We'll talk about why policy, the benefits and sometimes costs of policy interventions, theory and frameworks for policies. We'll talk about a couple of them. We'll talk a bit about evidence and how to determine whether a particular policy has evidence of effectiveness. And then we'll have a discussion about the roles that folks can play in working on policy. And we'll have Q&A kind of threaded throughout, and we hope to have time for a more extended Q&A session at the end. So next slide. So we'd actually like you to take a minute to use this QR code and take a little quiz. So why don't we give about 2 minutes for that, 2 or 3 minutes? And Amber and Ashley, are there any special instructions for people, or just use the QR code and do the quiz?
Nope, just use a QR code or they can type in the link if that's more convenient.
I'm also
Great.
going to drop in the link too in the chat if that is easier for you to utilize. So just give me one moment, please.
That sounds good. I think it's a generational thing.
All right,
And
it
there,
is dropped in the chat. So if that is easier, please
great.
feel free to use that.
Thank you, Amber. And I think we'll everybody in this day and age multitasks. So while you're filling out that little brief quiz, let's go on to the next slide, and we'll start talking a little bit about our new policy curriculum. And so, as you can see, back in September, we did a webinar, slightly different cast of characters. Well, two of the three are different. I was part of that, and then colleague Rebecca Stelter from IRT and Michael Sparks from Sparks Initiatives did a webinar introducing our new policy curriculum. And you can access that, the video of that if you're interested. The link is at the bottom. But now I'll do a brief overview of that curriculum. So yes, we can go to the next slide. So the motivation for it, why did we do that webinar back in September? Why did we develop a new curriculum? Well, we spent about 15 or 20 minutes going through the motivation for it in that webinar, but I'll summarize here. And so part of the reason is that we've seen real growth in the past 10, 15, 20 years in scientific support demonstrating the efficacy of especially local alcohol, tobacco, and other drug policies. So we show some of that evidence in that previous webinar, the September webinar. And then there are some resources out there for actually doing policy, but it's limited for developing workforce capacity around policy development, policy implementation. So we felt like more support was needed for the field in that area. And then this is sort of a sweet spot for our PTTC. So Dr. Kim Wagner and I and our partners, such as Michael Sparks, have expertise in supporting coalition policy implementation, and as well as building the capacity of the prevention workforce on policy. That's been a focus of the Southeast PTTC since we started back in late 2018. And then we've developed this new curriculum for people working in prevention. So we're very excited to start rolling it out. So next slide, please. And I see a question, will we have access to the presentation slides and or recordings afterwards? Ashley or Amber, would you like to take that?
Sure, I can take that. Yes, we will send a post-webinar email out within a week. Typically, we do it much sooner. And that will include the slide deck for today's presentation, where you can find the recording and any other materials related to today's webinar, along with the evaluation GIBRA link, if you miss it.
Great, thank you so much. Very briefly, and again, if you're interested in more details, please reference that September webinar. But we used a process that's pretty well established for developing curricula and other things where you want expert input, both practitioner practitioner experts and researchers in this case, and it's called the Delphi method. And basically it's an iterative process, so you go through several rounds where you ask experts questions. And in this case, we asked them, well, what competencies would you like to see addressed? Do you think should be addressed in a curriculum on ATOD policy? So Rebecca Stelter, our colleague at IRT, and our colleague Janice Cooper-Schmidt led that process. And that is what helped us develop the curriculum. So if we go to the next slide. So there are really three key areas that are addressed in the curriculum. One is knowledge. And so you can see the different domains. And actually, this is the first one here. Domain 1 is the webinar we're doing now, the role of policy for prevention and reduction of ATOD problems. But you can see that there are other knowledge domains, knowledge of policy systems, policy research and analysis skills, policy development and adoption, policy implementation, evaluation of policy. And then we're also developing materials on substance-specific policies. So that's one area that the curriculum is meant to help facilitate. The second is readiness. And we really divide readiness into three different areas, three different aspects of readiness. One is the person who's driving the policy effort, whether it's a coalition coordinator or someone else in the community who is leading the charge. The second is whatever the larger group is, whether it's a community coalition or a prevention provider, service agency, a church, or different faith group, whatever the organization might be, the structure and the membership is another aspect of readiness that we focus on. And then finally, as you know, often a coalition or another organization is embedded within a larger organization, within a nonprofit or other a healthcare agency, whatever it might be. And so we believe that an important factor is the readiness of that larger unit, especially the leadership of that unit. And so that's another focus of the curriculum. And then finally, we focus on developing actual skills through practice, through a community of practice in policy implementation. And this uses the 10-step model that was developed by Michael Sparks and Sharon O'Hara some years ago. And we've actually tested and shown good evidence for it in an IAAA funded randomized community trial. So that's just a brief overview of the areas that are addressed in the curriculum. Next slide, please. This is a very busy slide. This is the phases. We really put this in for you to look at your leisure rather than try to go through it now. We will have in subsequent webinars, we will walk through this a bit more. If you go to the next slide. But we did want to let you know that if you have questions at this point, if you're interested in learning more, please feel free to reach out to Amber at the email address that's listed there. And I should mention, if we go back, Amber, I wonder if you would like to say something about the certificate of completion that happens after completing the phase 1 webinars.
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. So I think a lot of people on this webinar join us a lot and know that you typically receive a certificate after attending, and we're going to continue to do so throughout these webinars with this first phase of the curriculum. Mark went over the overview of the curriculum, and phase 1 consists of those 3 webinars, and you again will receive a certificate with the hours associated with each of those webinars. But we are also issuing a certificate when you complete all 3 webinars, and it's going to be a Prevention Policy Foundation certificate, noting that you successfully completed all 3, and this will give you an opportunity to apply for phase 2 of the curriculum, which Dr. Wolfson went through the overview of that, and that will be the readiness community of practice. So again, you'll have an opportunity to receive 4 certificates for this first phase. And I'll include the description of that in our post-webinar email as well.
Great, thank you so much, Amber. Well, let's go on to the next slide and bring in our panel. And so I don't see Traci on my. Is Traci still with us? Yes, great. Yeah. So what do you guys think? Is there a need for a new ATOD policy curriculum? Let me start with Traci and get your thoughts on that.
So first of all, it's great to see so many people here interested in this topic. I really happy to see so many people interested in learning more about ATOD policies. The ATOD policy world is complex. I've spent a whole career focusing on alcohol policy. I've also looked at tobacco policy and now cannabis policy, and each of those areas has different things to learn. But fundamentally, this type of curriculum, I think, is really important to help lay the groundwork, right? What is policy? What is the justification for policy? What are some things to think about policy work? And then understand that there's more knowledge that you'll gain by doing the work. The readiness piece of this curriculum, I think, is really, really important. I've worked with a lot of different coalitions, and some were not ready to do the work. I've also seen some organizations that wanted to go for the money and not really to do the policy work. And so I think understanding if your organization is the best place for doing policy work is really important. And then, thinking about how do you make an effective coalition, a coalition that moves towards action versus just coming together and chatting with each other. And then the skill building needed for the person or the people that are actually going to move that work forward. And having that practice space to build the skills, because that's the best way to do this work, is to practice together and build skills. So I really do think it's important and to have this curriculum, and I'm glad that you put it together.
Great, thank you so much, Traci. And Matt, what are your thoughts?
Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Rossheim. I'm an associate professor at the University of North Texas Health Science Center in Fort Worth, Texas. And likewise, really excited to be here with you all today. Just piggybacking off of what Traci said in terms of so many changes in recent years in terms of the policy landscape itself, what current laws look like, lots of unexpected things like post-COVID changes in alcohol to go laws and things like that, things that we didn't expect. And so we have these best practices in terms of prevention and control, these policies that we have demonstrated effectiveness, but in terms of some guidance on like the implementation of those, what does that look like in the current policy landscape, in the current retail landscape, as these products have changed, as our federal legal landscape is changing. And so having kind of an organized framework that, as Traci was saying, meets coalitions where they're at in terms of understanding the legal landscape, where we need to be moving towards and what that looks like and how to effectively do so, and the implementation and enforcement of it. And so having that kind of organization and coordination is very helpful for making it manageable.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. Really great points about the complexity, increasing complexity, the evolution of the policy landscape, the importance of readiness, and the usefulness, the utility of having some sort of organizing framework, some sort of conceptual map of what policy is and how to influence it. So let's go to the next slide. And I think in the interest of time, what we'll do is invite the audience to put in the chat any thoughts you have about whether there's a need for a new curriculum, whether it's something of interest to you. And so we'd love to hear your thoughts. But as you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and move on and ask you also to do a poll. Fill out a poll. And so we'd like to know a little bit more about your experience in the policy world. And so simple poll, we would like to know if you've led the implementation of a policy campaign, a coalition-based policy campaign. Have you been, rather than that, have you been a part of a team rather than leading it? Have you been a part of a team working to implement such a campaign, or have you not been part of any coalition-based policy work? And so if you want to take a moment to, let's give maybe 30 seconds or so to let people complete the poll, and then we'll take a look at the results. And I think in the future, we'll queue up Jeopardy music while these polls are happening. So yes, Amber, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion, Mark. I will definitely do that. It is activated. It is a Slido. And please don't stress out if you do not see the Slido. Sometimes IT blocks them. Please just put it in the chat. This isn't supposed to be stress inducing. Although I do see a lot of people voting right now or including their responses, and it's a race. It was fun seeing everything going back and forth. It looks like it's starting to even out. But like Mark suggested, please take a moment to fill that out. And if it didn't pop up on your screen, go ahead and just drop it in the chat as well.
Great job, Amber. I feel like this is election day coverage, and we're waiting to call the election.
That's right. So who's going to win?
Who's going to win? So do you have enough to announce the result, to call the election and show the results, or
sure.
Shall we give a little more time?
Yeah, I think so. And there's no right or wrong choice, right? This is just to get a pulse on people's experiences. So it looks like at just ahead at 43% of people have been a part of a team working to implement coalition-based policy campaigns. And then just below that is folks that have not had an opportunity to work on policy. And then the last one, people leading at 17%. And I can't see the chat right now, so there might be responses in the chat that I didn't compute with these.
Okay, great. Well, so about 60% of folks, it sounds like, have had direct experience, and 40% not. So that's great. We really welcome folks at all different points along their policy journeys. So let's go to the next slide, and let's start with the definition of policy. And so there are many definitions of policy out there, but this is a definition that CDC has used. And I think it's a workable definition. Policy is a law, regulation, procedure, administrative action, incentive, or potentially even a voluntary practice of governments and other institutions. Let's go to the next slide. And this is maybe a little bit basic, but it's always useful, I think, to remind ourselves that policy can happen at different levels in our federal system in the United States, so our federated system. And so we, of course, have federal policy, state policy, and we also have local policy, both county and city policy. And as you can see in the next slide, there's even international policy. So, for example, the World Health Organization does things like the Framework Convention for Tobacco Control, which has been very important and influential internationally in trying to galvanize tobacco policy worldwide. So let's go to the next slide. And An important distinction, many of you will already be familiar with this, but there's public policy, which is usually what we think about first. And you can read some examples from the ATOD world here. And then there's also institutional or organizational policy. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as public policy being big P policy and organizational policy being small p policy. But both are important for the work that we do in public health and substance misuse prevention. So let's go to the next slide. And I'd like to bring in the panel on this. And, there are different opportunities at different levels, and they kind of wax and wane, I would argue. And sometimes there's a lot of opportunity. It might be a lot of opportunity at the federal level. Sometimes it might be at the local level. So, Matt, I'd love to get your thoughts on where the action is in the contemporary period, the current period. Is it public? Is it institutional? Is it at a certain level of policy, or is it all of the above?
Great question. So yeah, all of the above. They're all really important. I'm interested in Traci's take on this as well. Right now, I think at the state level is where a lot of the action is at. I think at the higher levels, it kind of influences what's possible from the federal level, what's possible at the state level, and so forth, state to local level. But I think in terms of industry resources, so if these industries are working, they're spending lots of money on advertising and also lobbying for laws that are favorable for them, for things that promote use, right? And if we're working to prevent and reduce use, I think their resources are more fragmented because there's 50 states. And so I think that's the major battleground that's happening right now on a lot of these substances. So it's kind of, having to fragment their resources as an industry, and ideally we can pass laws that are as protective as possible, or at the very least not preempting localities from passing more protective laws.
Great, thank you, Matt. And Matt, could you do one of the quiz questions, I think, was actually about preemption. Could you briefly describe what that term means?
Sure. So at a higher level of government, they have a law that preempts a lower level, whether it's a state or locality, from passing a law that is more protective. And so this is what a lot of these industries, including emerging industries like the kratom industry and things like that, are trying to do. Is they're trying to spend their resources lobbying at ideally the federal level to prevent states from passing stronger, more protective laws, and then in a lot of state laws as well, essentially preventing some of these best practices, policies, and prevention and control. Things like not allowing restrictions on sales or marketing or taxes or things like that at a more local level.
Great, thank you so much. And Traci, what are your thoughts about where the opportunities lie these days?
I think it's a really complex question, actually, and it really depends. One of my favorite things to say to my students is learn to be comfortable with the phrase, it depends. It depends on the product, it depends on the particular policy you're talking about. So I'll give a couple examples, but I also just wanted to mention tribal policy is really important. Each tribal nation sets policies that are really relevant to ATOD. So I don't like to lose sight of that. With my point that it's, by the complexity, I'll just give a couple examples. At the federal level, most of the control for alcohol was given to the state. The states is a state right, and then some states allow local control. With cannabis, it's very interesting, right? Because there is a lot of action happening at various states, and yet the federal government is making changes while we speak, rescheduling the medical cannabis and potentially rescheduling other forms of cannabis, and then with intoxicating hemp products, potentially putting them back as a Schedule I drugs starting in the fall. So it's very complicated at the federal level. And then we're seeing these changes at the state level. And then some states allow some policies to control availability of cannabis at the local level. But with alcohol, tobacco, and other drugs, that control, because of preemption, really varies for all of the substances. And sometimes it's better to start with a new policy at an institutional or local level, if that is allowable, to build support for the state. And it's going to also vary by your state, right? Because I actually really like state level policies, as Matt was talking about. But our state right now is almost evenly split between Republicans and Democrats, and nothing is moving. And so I think a lot of strategists, policy strategists, are saying we have to go to the local or institutional level if we're going to get anything moved in our state. So it really does depend. But I do think we can see action at all levels with enough strategy.
Great. Well, thanks to both of you so much for your insights. And I think it's a really interesting question for everyone to think about. I mean, maybe people can reflect a little bit. And maybe we'll bring up the next slide where you think the action is, audience members. And if you want to go ahead and put that in the chat. But I really like what I heard about this idea of thinking flexibly and strategically. And, when opportunities are blocked at one level, maybe there are opportunities at another level. And maybe it's a matter of building with institutional policy first or local policy first and building to state or national policy. So with that, let's go on to the next slide. And I want to briefly make an argument for why it's really important for all of us to learn about policy. And it's basically a three-part argument. So if we go to the next slide. So just as a summary, I think, as you've heard, that policy can be a really critical lever in a really effective mechanism for behavior change and for promoting population health. And this isn't just true for ATOD. I mean, this is true in terms of all areas of health: infectious disease, chronic disease, injury, etc. And we teach this in our MPH program, our Master of Public Health program here at University of California, Riverside. And so there are some great examples that are outside the ATOD realm, which include things like laws around supplementing cereal products with folic acid, which has dramatically reduced birth defects, neural tube defects in the United States. So we know policy can be very effective, at least sometimes. I would argue that it is, or at least should be, a central element of public health and prevention practice. And finally, as was mentioned by, I think, both our panelists, it's complicated. And it's complicated from a strategic point of view, but there are also some really interesting legal, ethical, and philosophical issues associated with public health policy. We'll talk about, in particular, some of the legal issues in just a moment. So next slide, please. So in terms of it being a highly effective strategy for behavior change and population health, if we go to the next slide, my favorite example is still the minimum legal drinking age. And this is, by most accounts, widely recognized as one of the great public health successes of the 20th century, the 21-year-old drinking age. It's not a panacea, as we all know. It doesn't solve everything. It hasn't eliminated youth drinking. It hasn't eliminated sales to underage people, but it's made a huge difference in drinking morbidity and mortality. So you can see here from the CDC that the minimum legal drinking age of 21 has resulted in fewer vehicle crashes, less underage drinking, and other components of safer and healthier people and communities. So it's been one of the dramatic successes of the 20th century and now into, of course, the 21st century, in my opinion. So next slide, please. Now, I think it is important always to remember when you think about policies and you study policy, that policies aren't always effective. And, maybe this is obvious, but sometimes a policy could be ineffective. And so it's really important to evaluate policies and build the science around policies. So it can be ineffective. And in some cases, it could even have negative unintended consequences. We can't always anticipate what the impact of policy will be. And in some cases, it may reduce health disparities, but in others, it may actually increase health disparities. And we'll provide some resources at the end if people are interested in learning more about that topic. So let's go to the next slide. So I'd like to bring in our panel now, and I used my favorite example, which is the minimum legal drinking age. But I'd like to see if you have a favorite example that you'd like to use of a policy, an ATOD policy that really works. So Traci, would you like to start?
Mark, you stole mine. The age 21 minimum legal drinking age.
I apologize. Yeah, I know you're. And we could have Matt go first if you'd like to think about it, but I know you've done a lot of work.
I have other things to say, but it is true. It's been such a well-studied policy, and we have so much evidence that it works. And it's also great that we're seeing have an age 21 age for tobacco, and as states are legalizing cannabis, they're putting age restrictions on. Not every state has it for the intoxicating hemp products, however. So that probably should change as we move forward if those products stay around. But I also think the excise tax on alcohol is another really well-studied policy that has shown to be effective. And that's because people are price sensitive. As the price goes up, people tend to use less, and we see fewer problems associated with things like alcohol. So that would be my second favorite.
Great, thanks, Traci. And I see in the chat someone mentioned social host policy focused on social availability of alcohol to young people. Matt, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. It's more of a general category, but any policies that reduce retail access. This can look different ways. We know that alcohol outlet density is strongly associated with higher use. It can do this through a number of mechanisms. One is when it's just everywhere, it changes the culture and norms and floods it with advertising, targeted advertising, because they have to compete with each other, right? So it's more targeted to specific demographics. It can drive down prices, and it's just everywhere. The more convenient it is, if it's sold in the types of stores, gas station, convenience stores, corner stores, the types of stores that kids have access to and are exposed to the marketing, it's just very problematic. I feel like we're at a different starting place in a lot of states for these intoxicating THC products, whether they're called hemp or not. A lot of my research is showing that a lot of them are misclassified as so-called hemp products when really they're essentially just marijuana products. So, a somewhat more controversial take is I advocate for outright prohibitions in a lot of states on these substances. It's hard to regulate them in the similar ways to how we have for alcohol and tobacco. And you mentioned like age gating and the 21 law. As we've seen over time, it's resulted in lower use. And at the same time, tobacco and alcohol are still the leading substances used by underage young people. It's getting harder and harder to implement effective age gating with fake IDs becoming more high quality, inexpensive, readily available. They have fake IDs that can scan, that have the holograms and everything. It's really hard to detect. And with increased online sales and sales through third-party providers like these delivery apps and things like that, terms of accountability. And so I'd say, regardless of what the policy looks like, any policies that make it harder to access these products commercially are among my favorite.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both Matt and Traci. Some great examples there. And Ashley knows from when I teach, I'm always arguing that price is one of our great levers, right? Increasing the price of potentially harmful products. So let's go on to the next slide and invite the audience to go ahead and put in the chat, and we'll publish this. We'll do an analysis later. I'm trying to move things. We're trying to move through things quickly, but we'd love to hear, to see in the chat what your favorite example of a ATOD policy that works is. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. And yeah, so at least in theory, policy is a central element of both public health practice and prevention practice. And so some of you may be familiar with the idea of the 10 essential public health services. And you can see that policy development covers 4 of those. And so at least rhetorically, policy is a central part of the functions of public health. If we go to the next slide, we know in the prevention world as well, substance use prevention world, that policy and environmental strategies are one of the endorsed approaches by SAMHSA and by CSAP, the Center for Substance Abuse Prevention. But what I think is interesting is when you look at data on how much activity there actually is in this area, it's a little bit disappointing. And so this is from the 2024 Drug-Free Communities Evaluation, 2024 data published in 2025. You can find this online if you're interested. And the DFC-funded coalitions were asked about whether they were working on implementing 7 strategies for community change. And you can see that even a fairly weakly worded educate or inform about modifying or changing policies and laws rated among the lowest, and changing consequences, which is a big part of policy, was even a bit lower. And if we look at the next slide, it's a little hard to read, but most of that work on educating or informing about modifying or changing policies was, the largest percentage was drug-free schools. And so really, to the extent, I would argue probably an inadequate focus on policy by DFC coalitions, given what we know about the effectiveness of policy for population level change, and fairly narrowly focused on schools, and often fairly narrowly focused on schools and institutional policy. So this is not, I don't mean to, some of you may be from DFC coalitions and doing fantastic work, but I think systemically this is an area where we're interested in trying to support more work in this area. Next slide, please. And then I want to talk briefly about a set of legal and ethical issues related to policy. And basically, it goes under a couple of different names. Sometimes it's called the police powers of the state. By the state, I don't mean literally the state like North Carolina or California. I mean government generally. And sometimes it's called the public health powers or public health authority of the state. And so we know that government has some authority to establish and enforce public health measures. And often we think of examples like isolation of people who have a communicable disease, quarantine, and inspection of food facilities, other facilities serving the public. Excuse me. Let's go to the next slide. But it is important to know as we navigate the policy world that, so this is sort of repeating this idea that states have inherent authority to protect the population that they serve, whether it's health, safety, morals, and general welfare. And the second bullet also refers to the powers that states have, that governments have to, in a broad range of areas, including injury, disease prevention, sanitation, environmental protection, etc. But if we go to the next slide, it's just important to remember that this authority is not unlimited, and it has to be balanced. It has to be balanced with autonomy, individual autonomy, privacy, liberty, and property under our legal system. And so while the highest court, the Supreme Court, historically has often deferred to public health authorities in matters of public health, it really engages in strict scrutiny. It looks very carefully if that involves infringement of what it considers to be fundamental freedoms or discriminates against a particular class of people. When it does this, when it exercises its police power or public health authority. And if we go to the next slide, I think this has increased since COVID-19. So COVID-19, there were a lot of public health efforts to control COVID-19, right? And so there was masking, there was social distancing, there was closure of facilities, there were a range of, and finally vaccination policies. So a range of policies, and we've seen pushback. And so this is a very interesting article that you might want to look at about how the courts have responded to COVID-19 measures. So what I'd like to do is actually turn to our panel at this point and thinking about ATOD policy. I'm wondering if you've seen greater pushback against ATOD policy in recent years based on these kinds of arguments around individual liberties and government overreach. Who would like to start? I'll do this one as a jump ball.
Pointing at me? Okay. Sure. So I think there's been a cycle, even before the COVID-19 of this kind of panic and neglect or even disdain, where it's a cycle of like crisis-driven short-term investment. Like, why aren't public health professionals all over this when it's been disinvested in? And then when there's an emergency or the perception of an emergency, the panic sets in, and then a flood of resources to try to solve a specific problem. So that's kind of the more pessimistic view of it. I would say, I'll borrow a quote from one of my colleagues here in terms of how this looks like for ATOD. And so, I'd say regardless of, political spectrum, there are shared philosophies, a core belief that in justice and that we owe something to one another, right? Even though we tend to be more of an individualist society than other, more collectivist societies. And in understanding that, it can give an idea of the feasibility of specific types of policy interventions, given the current landscape, what the constraints are, where there might be potential room to push back, how to shape narratives and effectively advocate for those policies based on those underlying values, even in a landscape that would otherwise seem not supportive of that type of policy intervention.
Great, thank you, Matt. And Traci, do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, thinking about the change part, like, do I see a change? Throughout my career working on alcohol policy, there's been discussions about, individual freedoms, and you can't tell people what to do. And so I don't know that there's a change. In the early days, we focused a lot on underage drinking because for a lot of policymakers, we thought that was more palatable, or that everyone cares about kids, right? And so if we can explain that alcohol was putting kids at risk, that they might be more open to policy. And I think that was true. Of course, the issue is that young people are affected by policies that are not specific to underage drinking, and so we have to expand and not just focus on those policies. With cannabis, it's very interesting because maybe some of the same elected officials that might argue about, against things like masking and putting some restrictions on individual freedom for public health, they might be against some of them. If I'm talking to people in my state, some of those same elected officials would be really okay putting more restrictions on cannabis or eliminating cannabis in our state. So again, I think it depends on the context. And I think, Matt, you said this about the specific policy that's being proposed and maybe the products that we're talking about.
And just piggybacking off that, I think the freedom argument cuts both ways, right? Freedom from addiction, freedom to, drive on a road and not have intoxicated drivers on the road, freedom from exposure to secondhand smoke and things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because we should be free from experiencing consequences because of someone else's alcohol or other drug use.
You're muted. Still muted.
You're still muted.
Sorry about that. Let's invite the audience to weigh in as well and move on to, so have you seen greater pushback, audience members, in your work, especially around policy in recent years? We'd love to hear what you have to say about that. So let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to really go quickly over this, and we'll mainly as a setup for you, Traci and Matt, to see what your thoughts are. So I'd like to talk briefly about two policy theories or frameworks. One is this idea of policy instruments, and the other is this idea of the 4 Ps of policy. So if we go to the next slide, one of the ways that the mechanisms of policy has been characterized is this idea of carrots, sticks, and sermons. And so the idea of sticks is regulation laws where there are negative consequences, where you could be punished, be subject to some sort of punishment if you don't comply. Carrots, this is a saying that we use all the time, carrots versus sticks. And usually it's economic means, although one could think of other kinds of incentives beyond monetary incentives. And then the way this idea of sermons is typically used, it can be persuasion, but it can also be simply providing information. It can be education. And we know that's something that governments do a lot of, right? They sponsor media campaigns, for example. And so this is, I think, sometimes an interesting way to think about policies that you're looking at. And if we go to the next slide, and often policies are complex and might involve a combination of carrots, sticks, and sermons. And then on the next slide, we show a few examples from the ATO, or an example of each from the ATOD world. So DUI enforcement, could be a good example of sticks. Responsible beverage service, where retail outlets get a break on their liability. There's reduced liability or reduced insurance, for example, or reduced fees. Could be considered an economic approach. And then, I think I would argue that informational approaches, sermons are pervasive, right? We see that at every level. This is an example from the national federal Talk They Hear You campaign focused on encouraging parents to talk to their kids about drinking. So let's pull in our audience, rather our panel, and get your thoughts on, is this a framework that you use sometimes? Do you think about, is it useful to think about sticks, carrots, sermons? And let me start with Traci.
I've thought about this framework a lot throughout my career, and I have found it very useful to think about. I'll give examples. And like Matt, I'm very concerned about the retail environment. And so when we're talking about retailers, we want them to comply with the law. It's a privilege to have a license to sell some of these products, and we want them to comply. And so going back to the underage drinking, we have this age 21 drinking age that is effective, but as Mark said, it doesn't solve all issues. And we saw bars, restaurants, liquor stores, convenience stores, etc., still selling to underage people despite it being against the law to do so. And so one of the approaches was to use the responsible beverage service, right? We're gonna provide education to the servers and the staff so that they would know what the law is, which is the first step. If people don't know that the law doesn't exist, they're not going to comply with it. So I really think we need to provide that information, right? And maybe we do have to have some kind of economic, provide some economic incentive for people, for establishments to train their staff. But we know that alone will not prevent underage sales. So what we learned is that we have to have the stick. So we have the compliance checks where law enforcement sends in an underage person under their supervision to attempt to purchase alcohol. If there's a sale made, then the server or clerk is held accountable. Also, hopefully, the license holder, who ultimately has the most power in those situations, would be held accountable. And the research shows that regular compliance checks is very effective in reducing the likelihood of those illegal sales. But it's really key that people know what the law is, that they believe that there's a certainty that they're going to get caught. And that's where that regular compliance checks comes in. And that's connected to deterrence theory. So I think that framework really helps us think about, what information is really important, what do they need, maybe again provide some incentive to comply. And oftentimes we find out that if people and organizations think there's no consequences for not complying with the law, they won't. And so we have to have that stick, making sure that it's equitably used, of course. So important framework.
Great. And Matt, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Sure, just really briefly. So use the stick a lot for, manufacturers and retailers, and sermons for the decision makers, lawmakers, or those setting the institutional policies. As Traci mentioned, in terms of equitable, not the pup laws, purchase, use, possession, not going after kids who are, winding up having, possessing these substances, but going further upstream and actually being an effective deterrent from getting it in their hands in the first place.
Great. Well, thank you. And let's invite the audience. And I see people are already commenting on carrots and sticks, but let's move on to the 4 Ps. And actually, Matt, I'd like to call on you because I know you use this framework quite a bit in your work, and so I wonder if you could walk us through the 4 Ps and make a few observations on its utility, its usefulness.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's a very helpful framework for thinking about uh, the tools that the industry uses for promoting use of their products, to get people to start using their products, to use it more heavily, more regularly, to switch to their brand of products, to foster brand loyalty. So when we're thinking of those policy levers in terms of access or availability, retail price, marketing, all of those things are modifiable via policies. And so this is a way to organize the different characteristics of the products, their marketing, their space, the retail space, in a way that can help guide policy interventions that directly impact those aspects of marketing.
Great point. Thank you so much. It does seem like something that's useful for understanding how industries operate, but also what some of our targets for intervention can be. So I really like the way you said that. So if we go to the next slide, this was not actually a paid public service announcement, but we wanted to point out that there's a great, fairly recent paper that I've used in class on the evolving alcohol landscape, implications for public health and policy using the 4P framework by our very own panelist, Matt Rossheim, and Michael Sparks, one of our audience members. So let's move on. And I want to ask, are there other frameworks? And so, one that comes to mind for me is deterrence theory. And deterrence theory is pretty central, general deterrence, specific deterrence, the importance of decay that we see happen when there's not enforcement. So that's one that I would think of. But do you want to say anything about either deterrence or other frameworks that you find helpful for thinking about policy?
I'd like to expand on the deterrence theory, if that's okay, because I think it's really important. And again, it's tied to the stick when we're talking about the carrot, sticks, and sermons. Keep in mind that with deterrence theory, there's three components that we talk about: the perceived certainty of getting caught, the severity of the consequence if you are caught, and then how swiftly that consequence is applied. And the research that is out there suggests that perceived certainty may be the most important component, because again, if you don't think you're going to get caught, it's not going to deter you from anything. But if you are caught, that severity, sometimes we want to really make it really severe. And there's also evidence that you have to have it be meaningful. But if it's too severe, then the enforcers don't want to enforce it. So you have to find that balancing act of making it meaningful and something that is actually going to be applied. And then, if it's criminal, it's going to get caught in the court system, and it could be years before someone faces a consequence. So often there's recommendations to have administrative penalties because they may be more swiftly applied. So it's thinking of those concepts. And the specific deterrence is what Mark mentioned, is when someone is caught, the deterrence hopefully prevents you from breaking the law or violating that policy in the future. General deterrence is that we create this effect that people comply with the law because they think they're getting caught. So it kind of spills over to the general population. Best example that I come up with in my class is, there are roads I do not speed on. And I like peppy cars, right? But if I know that the police officers are parked on that street a lot, I do not speed. So that's like a general deterrent effect. They don't have to catch me to prevent me from speeding in that area. So in ATOD, we like to think about how can we create that general effect to prevent people from violating laws and policies to begin with.
Great, thank you, Traci. And Matt.
I use the 4Ps framework most often, and I feel like it's helpful for conceptualizing even changes in the market. If a new product or a new, way of accessing alcohol or a new way that they're marketing substances, to help figure out how that kind of fits into the marketing mix and changes things big picture. I'd say another one that I use that's seems relatively obvious is just availability theory. The more widely available a substance is, the more people use it and the more resulting harm that comes from it. And even at the top of that, we have policies that then shape retail availability.
I like that one too.
Great. Well, thank you both. Let's go ahead and move on in the interest of time. And so let's talk a little bit about effectiveness of policy. And so one of the things that I talk about with my MPH students, and this is a standard part of public health curricula, is thinking about evidence and different levels of evidence. And we know that you can find a study that will say almost anything, right? And part of that is by chance. If you have 100 studies, by the laws of probability, you use a 5%, 0.05 significance level, then 5 out of 100 are just going to happen by chance. And so what is often most useful is not to ignore individual studies and look at the rigor of individual studies and know how to really be a good consumer of individual studies, but to kind of move up that hierarchy of evidence. And so things like narrative reviews, systematic reviews, meta-analyses, and even guidelines, practice guidelines, which we find in medicine, but also in public health. And so if we go to the next slide, one of my favorite such guidelines is the community guide. And this is loosely affiliated with CDC. It's not under the direct control of CDC, but CDC supports the Community Preventive Services Task Force, as I understand the reporting lines. And this is a great resource, in my opinion, for all manner of public health issues, including ATOD. And so if we go to the next slide, and actually, I got my slides a little bit out of order. So if we go to the next slide after this, I will point out, this may be of interest to many of you, that there's a very recent report from the Community Preventive Services Task Force, the Community Guide, recommending community interventions involving coalitions or partnerships to prevent substance use among youth. So this is pretty exciting to see that the systematic review shows that these interventions reduce initiation and use of cannabis, tobacco, alcohol, and illegal substances. But we're talking about policy specifically today. So if we go to the next slide, the example I have in here, and it's a little hard to read, but this is a screenshot from the guide, and you can see the way it works. It's basically like a scorecard or a grade. It grades different strategies based on evidence. And so you can see here in relation to reducing alcohol impaired driving, 0.08 laws at the state level are recommended. They considered after a very careful review to have strong evidence and so forth. So I think this is a great resource that sometimes people in the field aren't that familiar with. So let's go. Let's go to our panelists and see what thoughts you have on resources. And I will point out, actually, Ashley, if we could just put it in reverse and back up a little bit. Sorry about that. One more. Yeah. So back down again. The one with the different resources. Where did that go? There we go. Thank you. So I'm a terrible backseat driver, in case you haven't noticed. But here are a few other links that may be of interest to you that you may already be familiar with. But let's invite our panelists in and see what your ideas are in terms of figuring out what works. What's your advice for folks working in communities to figure out whether a potential strategy might be effective? And Ashley, we can go to to the slide showing the smiling faces of our panelists.
Do you want to go first or do you want me to? Okay. Oh gosh, I'll try to keep it brief. So there are guides that, from credible agencies that put forth, best practices in prevention and control. Some are substance specific or modality specific. Some are, work across the board. If you can reduce retail access and increase price across substances, it's going to result in reduced use. I would say it's important in developing these guides and doing in the review studies themselves to be careful of industry funding. There's a clear history across substances of extreme bias in research findings that are funded by the industry, and it's getting harder and harder to determine what industry funding is because now they've got shell games of different associations and groups that they use that they fund to promote research that's counter to research that's either not funded or funded by NIH or other similar agencies. I'd say the harder part though isn't in identifying the best practices themselves. I think the hardest part is actually making it fit and making it work. So what do I mean by that? So on the front end, assessing the community conditions and building the need, getting the support for the policy change, figuring out what those quality of life issues are that resonates with the community or with the state, figuring out how the best practice, like the model language, fits within existing laws. So how do we, match and map and patch and pool and like fit this into, and what are the deal breakers in it? What one change in the law is going to make it, ineffective, counter-effective, not able to be enforced, completely undermine it. So what are those deal breakers? And then the enforcement piece, if it's not being enforced, these industries aren't going to voluntarily comply. So where's the teeth in it? Where's the funding for enforcing? What's the agency? How do we make it as simple as possible and inexpensive as possible? If it requires complex testing or expert testimony, like it's already failed, it's got to be hard to evade and simple to enforce. So yeah, that's in a nutshell my take.
Great points. Thanks, Matt and Traci.
Great minds think alike, Matt, because I was going down the same path. I do think that there are these great resources that Matt has mentioned, and obviously we want to look at, if there's multiple studies that are robust, really good studies, we'd like to look at that evidence. But over the years, someone would contact me and ask about, what works, or, they might say, we're working on this policy because we heard another state implemented that policy. And my thought is always like, well, okay, but is it a good fit for your state? And I'd really like to emphasize what Matt said. It's like, for example, if you're cutting off sources of alcohol, tobacco, or cannabis for kids, you need to understand in your community or in your state where are kids getting those products, and then make sure that your strategy, that policy strategy, is going to address, the sources that they're actually using. And I just think that's so critical. And then not negotiating away the thing that's going to make it enforceable. We've seen that happen over and over again. So we have policies on the books that are basically ineffective because nothing can be done with them. So getting that statutory and regulatory language good. And then implementation, it's not just getting it passed. We have to pay attention to what happens after it's passed with enforcement. And again, making people aware that the policy exists. So it's kind of all of those things to make sure that we have effective policies in place.
Great. Well, thank you both. And I'm getting time warnings, so I'm going to keep moving us along. So, but these are great points. So if we go to the next slide, I think we have one final substantive area, and the idea here is that there are a lot of different roles people can play in policy, and there's some examples here. But I'd like to actually go to the next slide and turn to the audience, to our panelists, and get some ideas from each of you about different ways you've seen people engage in policy efforts. Matt, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, I'll keep it brief because I know we're running a long time, but kind of the way that I tend to organize it in my head is understanding the mission. So, what is the current law? What is the ideal law? And what are the deal breakers? Uh, who needs to be on the team? So, building the team. Who needs to be at the table? Who can buy into this mission? How do we then map out that mission in terms of the formal processes and all the informal processes that need to take place? And then how do we tell the story? So, how do we tell the story to recruit people to this coalition? How do we tell the story to lawmakers? How do we need to, make a publicly visible campaign, whether it's, a grassroots movement or something like that? What's the story that needs to be told? How does this need to be framed and packaged in order to get that change? And then, as Traci was mentioning, it's not over once the law is passed. That work continues in terms of how do we demonstrate effective, how do we make sure that it's effective and enforced? How do we demonstrate that? What data do we need to help tell that story both on the front end and the back end to celebrate the success and show that it worked and sustain buy-in so that it doesn't just get changed, a year or two later?
I like the slide that you had, Mark, that showed so many different roles. And I think that there are some people, like I've trained students who become lobbyists, and who love being down at the Capitol and doing that kind of work. And I have some students who get exposed to it and they say, never would I ever want to do that. So I think it's really important to understand kind of what your own comfort is. And then, as Matt said, building your team is going to be so important. We need some people that are really comfortable being in those front lines, that can tell the story, that can build the relationships. And we need people that can do the assessments, that collect the data, that analyze the data, that analyze the existing literature, doing policy analyses. So there's just so many different roles. Some of us are going to be more in the background, and some are going to be more up front. We need that team of people. And I did a quick glance at that slide, Mark, but one thing that I think might be missing is being an effective manager. Some of you may be putting that team together, and you put that team together and you back them up, give them the space to go out and do their one-on-ones and do the advocacy work and battle the organization to give them the space to do the policy work that is going to put effective policies in place and make a difference.
So really terrific points. And I also want to point out that there's an interesting comment from Michael Sparks about this is part of what our curriculum is meant to do, is help people understand what role they want to play in policy. What's the best role for them to play? And that's actually part of the readiness component in what we call phase 2 of the curriculum. So thank you, Michael, for making that point. So we'll go to the next slide. And so if you'd like to put in the chat, audience members, ways you've seen people, other ideas you might have about how people and communities can engage in policy efforts, we'd love to see it. And let's go on to the next slide. And so just by way of review, we've tried to do a introduction to our new policy curriculum. And if you're interested, you can take a look at the September webinar. We tried to cover the arguments for some of the key arguments for policy, thinking about both benefits but also potential costs. We talked about a couple of theories and frameworks and added one that's really important, which is deterrence. So we'll include some resources on that in our follow-up materials. And we talked a little bit about this idea of how do you discern what the evidence is for policy, as well as what roles people can play in trying to promote policy. So let's go to the next slide. And so we'll compile resources, and what we'd like to do is include some of the resources that our panelists have mentioned, in addition to ones we already have at hand. So stay tuned and check our website in a couple of weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, and we'll have that posted.